Hello, you are listening to A Woman's Guide, episode 22. Are you emotionally spent, worn out, and in a low place? Do you know the causes of this, whether it derives from you or someone else? Today's episode is dealing with emotional slumps, emotional fatigue, and exhaustion, part 1. Stay tuned. Guide to reclaiming wholeness after sexual abuse. For all of you listening, welcome to the show. I am Simone, your confidant and guide. Thank you for tuning in. So today, I'm going to be speaking about emotional slumps. I'm pretty sure you haven't really heard it termed that way before, emotional slumps. But I definitely know that this is something that we experience I don't know how many times, maybe once a year or twice a year or maybe more. But basically, this is defining emotional slumps the best way I can, is that these are the times in which we feel less than our best emotionally and physically. So we're not functioning normally up to par as we usually would. We're not at our optimum, and we aren't our best self. So we may be drained emotionally, slow, tired, we're easily burnt out. And it's not to say, and it could encompass this, but it's not to say that we are necessarily depressed. Okay, depression really in a definition that we don't really think about it is really to just be low and slow. That's really what depression is. Okay, but depression we always think about as being, having hopelessness, feelings of hopelessness, feeling sadness, despair, despondency. But really, technically in this situation, yes, we are depressed, so that means we are drained, we're slow, we're tired, we're not functioning at our optimum in that regard. But it doesn't necessarily mean we are depressed. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not that we're necessarily in a state of depression, which is despair or hopelessness or despondency. So you can be depressed in an emotional slump, but you don't always have to be depressed. It's not always that we are depressed. So yes, you can feel hopeless and sad and anxious, or you can feel empty, numb, nonchalant, and uncaring within your life. You just feel pretty much, you just don't feel, you have no feeling toward your life. You're feeling detached and numb. No joy and excitement or anything, or about the things you used to feel excitement. And yes, I'm describing depression, but it doesn't necessarily have to be depression. It's just you are just not at your best. You are not at your optimum. So you're feeling more. Another thing is you feel more like, basically what I'm explaining is you're having this deadening feeling, which is more I would describe as emotional fatigue. And that's something that I'm going to be speaking of very shortly. Okay, but emotional slumps, this is why I'm making it a different show from depression, because emotional slumps are something that it can last a relatively short time. It can last a few hours, it can last a day, it can last a couple days, it can last a week, but it doesn't necessarily, it's different from a depression. It's different from being in a state of depression, which can last years on and off. It can last 2 years, it can last however long, but emotional slumps are just those periods of times where we're not our best, okay? And it depends on what triggers it. So that's another thing. It depends on what triggers these emotional slumps. Why there's really a difference between those two, but then it can mesh together and you can have an emotional slump of depression, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And when and this is another way that I can make you understand sort of a difference, is that emotional slumps can occur when we are extending ourselves too much. So what that means is, when you, let's say if you're self-sacrificing, if you're in a codependent relationship or you have issues of codependency, you're extending too much of yourself energetically, emotionally, mentally. You do it for too long, you do it too fast with too many people. You're going at a speed in which you cannot recuperate, you can't replenish. You're just extending too much out. And without that, and when you do that, it causes you to not have enough alone time or enough time for self-care, for nurturing. Okay? And that's where this whole emotional slump can come from. Also, it can come in times of stress and change, in addition to or separate from those points that I just made, where you're going through a major life change, a major lifestyle change, a major change in your family, in your home space, in your career, in life. You're changing a lot of people. You're surrounding yourself with different people. You're not having the same relationships anymore. You're in the midst of a lot of major changes. That can cause an emotional slump as well. And during or after a loss or a death, that can also go with stress and change, where you're experiencing a lot of loss of people, a loss of the life you used to have, the way that you used to do things, the way that you used to conduct your life, or death with people. Death, in your family, people dying, losing people, dealing with grief. So anything distressing, draining, some kind of draining, distressing event can cause an emotional slump. It can cause an emotional slump. And also, emotional slumps can, in addition to what I just expressed, is that it can occur, quote unquote, randomly. And what I mean by that is, and of course, nothing is really at random, and nothing really does not have a cause. Everything has a cause. But what I mean by randomly on our healing journey is that we have times where, I guess the best way I can express it is that when you have a traumatic event or time in your life, there are times and cycles within yourself, energetic cycles, where you have times of ups and times of downs. I mean, you notice that there's times of energy and times of you have a burst of creativity and a burst of excitement and a burst of just things flowing in and out of you. And then there's times where you have downtime. You have times where it's not, where you're energetically lower. You have more of a lower energetic energy, okay? You have a lower energy. You're not as creative. You're not as efficient. You're not as, you're not as efficient and effective as you usually are. So there are cycles. And you know what? It doesn't have to just deal with a traumatic event or time in our life, because you do have these times, you do have these times where you're up and when you're down, and that's because of the things that you've experienced. So it does affect your cycles, and it does affect your moods, and it does affect your brain and the chemicals in your body. It affects these things. Okay, but I think just aside from that, we just have cycles. not your menstrual cycle. I mean, that can be that too, but there are just cycles where we have times where we're more hyper, we have more energy, we have more creativity, we have more of a burst of something. We have where we're go, 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 do, 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 do. And then there's times where we just have a lower energy because it's a cycle. There are times where it's higher, there's times when it's lower. There's times where we need to replenish. There's times where we need to come back to ourselves and reflect and contemplate. There's times where we need to get back in touch with ourselves, get back in touch with our world, and plan and strategize. And there's just, I believe that life has these flows and these cycles. Okay, they each serve a time, a period. I would see these as seasons as well, where you have a season where you're more go, 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 and then you have a time where it's more of a downtime, and there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of people going on. Your energy is low. Your mind is low. Your desire to want to do things is low. Okay? Just like if you want to go a step further and look at it this way, look at the seasons. I mean, literally, like the physical seasons in our world. I live in a place where we have all four seasons. So we have spring, we have summer, we have winter, and we have fall. So now if you look at these seasons, we're here, and I don't know where you're listening from, but here in Toronto, we have times where it is the leaves of the trees fall, okay? It gets colder, and the animals go into hibernation, and it's like this environment is getting ready to go into that kind of state where things are depressed. Let's put it that way. Technically, it's in a depressed state, so things are not growing, things are not buzzing, you know, birds are not around, and they're not chirping, they're leaving, and, you know, other animals are hibernating, and things are going into more of a depressed state. Okay, so things are not growing, and they're not coming into fruition and manifestation, and it gets colder, and it looks dead, and, you know, it looks kind of, to me, it looks kind of ugly. I mean, when the leaves turn colors, I mean, that's pretty, but when the leaves fall off and you just have all these little bare twigs and branches, it looks kind of ugly to me, because I'm thinking, where's all the green? Where's all the beauty? You know what I'm saying? And fall is really preparing it for winter, winter is really just hibernation. It's a time for the, you know, the systems to, I guess, go into, what's the word? It's going into remission. It's going into a place where it can prepare itself for the next season, which is spring. You understand? It's resting. It's giving itself time, you know, because things cannot be blooming all the time. Things cannot be growing all the time. You know, things cannot be reproducing all the time, because it's going to get burnt out. There are times where you need rest. You have resting phases. You have times where you need to rest, and the times you need to relax, the times you need to revitalize and replenish. And that's the way I see winter. That's the way I see winter. And even in some places, some tropical places, I know because my family is from a tropical place, that there are, even though they do not have winter, or they do not have fall in the way that we experience fall here in Toronto, there are certain seasons where certain fruits do not grow, or certain flowers or plants do not bloom, or they do not come into fruition. You know what I mean? They start to go into a resting phase, and then something else may come into fruition, but they still have those cycles. You know what I mean? Things are not as, you know, energetic, and certain things may not be blooming and coming into existence at that time, and certain animals may not be reproducing at that time. So there really are still seasons. But what I'm saying is that once the winter passes, and that time of sleep and hibernation and remission, and I guess the period of you know, the period of stillness and that period of depression has passed, then you have spring. And now everything is at full force now. It's at full speed. It has gone through that stage, and now that it can come into full bloom, now it has the energy, and these plants and these animals can come alive again, and they can come back, and things can become reproduced. And you know, that's how our world works. That's how these cycles work. And I think it's the same thing with us. I think it's the same thing with us. You know, it's just a natural part of our process. It's a natural part of our lives, you know. But of course, we can actually burn ourselves out, just like I was saying, with extending yourself too much. You can make that cycle occur a lot quicker, right? In a way where you're just extending and you're doing too much, and you're forcing yourself into that cycle where you have to be, you know, in that depressed state in order to revitalize and renew yourself and to refurbish yourself. So anyway, I hope I explained that enough. But for emotional fatigue goes very well with emotional slumps, because that's, if you can guess what that means, it's really, you know, we go through that. Emotional fatigue, just like the emotional slumps, and emotional fatigue can be an emotional slump. You understand? So it's not something that you really hear a lot. You hear mostly about physical fatigue and exhaustion, but you don't really hear about emotional fatigue. But emotional fatigue, and this is the best way I can simplify it, is that when you exceed your emotional reserves. Because we all have a limitation for what it is that we can feel and how we can handle things emotionally. It's the same thing with our bodies. Our bodies have a limit. It has a limit. So it has a limit to how much it can do and how much it can take and how much it can endure, until it gets to the point where it's so exhausted and depleted, it needs to rest. It needs vitamins, it needs minerals, it needs food, it needs fuel, it needs to refurbish itself and build itself back up for the next time. So physically, fatigue, you know, it is the same thing as emotional fatigue. It's just with our energy or emotional reserves or energy reserves within our mind. So you are, with emotional fatigue, you have exceeded your emotional reserve, so you've burnt it out. Just think about a tank, or you're running very low. Let's put it that way. Fatigue is really when you're running very low in your emotional reserve or your emotional capacity. You have run out. And it can go to, another way for me to say this is emotional exhaustion. And then that can go even further into emotional burnout, okay? Which is, it means that you have exhausted your ability to engage emotionally. Okay? You've exhausted your ability to engage emotionally. And emotional burnout, yeah, that just means when you're totally done. You're totally done. You don't have anything left within yourself to give emotionally, to participate emotionally. You're just burnt out. You're totally burnt out. And I think that with emotional burnout and or emotional fatigue, this occurs for people, okay? This occurs for people who have gone through so much battles and so many things where they had to extend so much energy of themselves. They had to extend so much of themselves emotionally and mentally to get them to where they are. Okay? Emotional fatigue occurs when you are using so much. You're extending so much. Just like I was saying with emotional slumps. You're extending so much of yourself emotionally and mentally that you get to the point where it's like it's It's just you've gotten to the end of that tank, right? And I know that humanistically, and we're speaking about humanistically here, humanistically, we have a limited capacity. We have a limited resource for this. We're limited resources, okay? We're limited resources humanistically. And this also includes emotional capacity, just like with physical capacity and how much we can physically exert ourselves and how we can physically endure and how much we can lift and how much we can do with our physical bodies. It's the same thing with emotional capacities. So at some point in your journey, it's been too much. It's just been too much. You've burnt it out. You've burnt it all out. Or you're running very, very low, and it's just been too much because you've used up all of that energy. I just think of a tank. I keep thinking of a tank. I keep thinking about a car. And a car has a tank, and it has a certain amount of fuel. And if you drive that car long enough, it's going to burn up all of that fuel till it gets to the point where that car cannot run anymore because you've used up all of its resource. You used up all of its fuel, and it needs to be refueled once again. You need to fill up that tank once again. I don't think we're any different. Emotionally, physically, mentally, we're not different. Human beings, we need to revitalize, we need to replenish, we need to re-energize ourselves. We need that. It's been too much. And you know what? Because because of the title of this podcast, of course, ladies, women who have gone through sexual abuse, and men, it's not just women, but men, anybody who has gone through some kind of traumatic event, but specifically sexual abuse, because that's what it's about, sexual abuse, and being a survivor of sexual abuse. It really, you're going to experience some emotional burnout if you're a survivor of sexual abuse, because you've had to overcome too many storms. You've been through too many storms to get to where you are. So you have used up a lot of emotional energy and a mental energy. And it's not just the abuse. It's not just the actual abuse that you've suffered. It's the aftermath. It's the aftermath. It's the effects. It's the things that happened after that abuse that you had to fight with and you had to overcome and you had to deal with in order for you to survive, in order for you to get well, in order for you to recover to the point where you can function, or you can emotionally function or mentally function. You've had to overcome a lot. You survived a lot dealing with that stuff. For example, like, what I mean by that is because of this abuse, it physically did something very real to your mind, and it did something to your emotional self and your emotional body. It changed something within you. So this is why we have a lot of depression. A lot of depression comes from this type of thing, sexual abuse. Depression, anxiety, anger, PTSD, and this is something I'm going to be speaking about in another episode. For sure, I cannot go without talking about PTSD. So PTSD, which encompasses those things, as well as other things. But yes, another video, another episode, okay? But depression, anxiety, anger, PTSD, you're always in fight or flight mode, or many times you're in fight or flight mode. You have trust issues with people. You know what I'm saying? You don't feel safe. You're scared. Those type of things. I mean, think about all those things that I just said. That's going to wear out your emotional reserves. That's all emotional stuff. All of that stuff is emotional. Okay? All of that stuff is emotional. Trauma is emotionally expensive and taxing. It is. As well as physical, too. Physically and psychologically. Okay? It's very, very taxing emotionally for us. So I know, like, emotional fatigue, I mean, that's that's pretty much a given. If you've gone through that stuff, it's a given. And I know, looking back at my life and my journey, and I'm speaking like I'm at the end of it. No, I'm not. But speaking of my journey getting to this point, I mean, it has been a lot, and it's been a lot of fighting, and it's been a lot of overcoming, and it has been a lot emotionally and mentally for me taxing, so taxing. And I'm thinking to myself, I know this is so expensive. It's so expensive to overcome sexual abuse. It's expensive, emotionally, mentally, physically, psychologically. It's so expensive to overcome and survive. So I know that emotional fatigue is a very appropriate thing to speak about, even though it's not very popular. Just like, for example, if I can make reference to battle fatigue, and there's a real term called battle fatigue, and this mainly goes with the scenario, not scenario, but the very real reality of people who have gone to war, soldiers who have gone to war, and they've gone to another country to fight, and because of all they had to go through psychologically, emotionally, mentally, physically, it totally wore them out. It totally wore them, and it caused them PTSD, okay? It has caused a lot of PTSD to happen within them, even after the battle. Not even after the battle was done, even though it was over, they experienced a lot of fatigue. And it affected them mightily because they still felt like they were in that battle. They were in that fight or flight mode. But that's just me getting into the PTSD. But I don't really want to get into that. I want to save that for another time. But battle fatigue. Battle fatigue. A lot of these soldiers who are no longer fighting, they're no longer fighting. They've experienced this stuff. They experience emotional abuse. They are not emotional abuse, emotional fatigue. They experience PTSD. All their emotional reserves have been spent out, spent out. But that's more, I would say that's more for PTSD, but still, it makes all of this, wrap into one thing here, because it's all the same. It really is all the same. But yes, trauma is emotionally taxing and expensive. It is. Overcoming, dealing with the aftermath, dealing with the after effects, dealing with everything else that you have to, the fact that you have to work twice as hard and you have to do twice as much that other people who have not gone through it has to do, okay? Because it's like you're living somewhat at a deficit, or somewhat where you just have this extra burden, you have these extra bags, you have this extra stuff to carry because, you have to carry this trauma at the same time while you're healing it. It's rough. It's really rough. It's really, really, really rough. So anyway, let me get into exhausted emotions, or emotional fatigue, and the symptoms I'd like to share about that. And of course, it's not going to be to the T, and it's not going to be the same for everyone, but this is just what I feel like, these are the symptoms relatively it should be for people who are emotionally fatigued or exhausted. Okay? Okay, so the first point is that emotionally and physically you're depleted and drained. Depleted and drained. Emotionally depleted and drained. So if you're emotionally burnt out or exhausted, that's what you're going to be feeling. Emotionally, physically depleted and drained. You're just spent. You're worn out. You're done. Also, okay, because there are other times where it's a little bit different. You can be hypersensitive emotionally. So that means you're overly emotional and reactive, angry, fearful, or anxious. Because I noticed that too. It's not just like you feel totally drained out emotionally. And you're still drained, but at the same time you can be hypersensitive emotionally. So overly emotional. But it's just because it's hard to explain. It's really hard to explain. You can be devoid of something, but you could still be showing those symptoms of you having a lot of it, but you don't really have a lot of it. That's just a reaction. You know what I'm saying? It's hard to explain. But anyway, you do not find joy in the things you used to. The things that you were so enamored about and excited about, the things that caused you so much joy, you don't have that when you're emotionally spent and burnt out. And you can understand that because, yes, you know that you enjoy, but because you have, and you also have the desire, but because you're so emotionally spent, you don't have the capacity. You don't have the capacity to have those feelings of joy and pleasure. You're worn out. You're worn out. You've lost that capacity to feel joy and happiness temporarily. Okay? You're emotionally shot. Because that's a big, I think that's a big point there. Because if you just find that you're just the things that you don't really have joy, the things that you have joy in usually, and all of a sudden you just don't feel joy, it's just like, whatever. It's nothing. It's like you're numb. You are numb. You can have a nonchalant and or careless attitude, just like a who cares kind of attitude. Nonchalant, careless attitude. So you're just like, the things that you know that you care about, the things you've always cared about, the things that you're so attentive to, you no longer have that. You just kind of, oh well, whatever, who cares? You have inattentiveness to people and things. People and things, you just don't really, it doesn't affect you the way it once did. It's just kind of like, you don't really have much desire to really pay attention to those things or those people or to their emotions. You have no desire to be conscientious. The things that you sit there and do with such detail and care and love and thoughtfulness, you don't really have that because it takes up too much energy. It takes up so much energy for you to be attentive and conscientious and look at things deeply and do things with care. It takes too much energy. So you may find yourself doing that. You have no desire to be conscientious, or you just can't seem to bring yourself to be conscientious. Another one is loss of focus. Absolutely, loss of focus. Yes. Because that also takes up energy. I mean, it's not just emotionally, but mentally too. It wears down on you emotionally, mentally. Even though you're being worn down emotionally, you can mentally be worn down as well. So then you lose focus, you lose concentration. You just don't have a desire to focus. You just don't have a desire to focus. Fogginess, confusion, you know what I mean? Emotionally and mentally, I would tie those two together because, of course, your emotion comes through your thoughts. Your emotion really comes from your mind anyway. It technically does. It really does. It literally comes from a different, it comes from a certain part of your mind. I don't remember exactly which part of your mind is responsible for emotions, but it literally comes from your mind. So you know that it's going to affect the way you think. It's going to affect the way you rationalize. It's going to affect your concentration. The next point is you're unable to deal with stress, stressful circumstances. You become overstressed. And this is where I think I can link it to being hypersensitive. You become hypersensitive. You become overstressed. So stress is just overly overwhelming to you. It's very overwhelming to you. You're just not able to handle stress the way you once did. You know, you want to just crawl into your bed, or you just feel like you can't deal with it. You lock yourself in your bedroom or your bathroom. You just can't handle that one more phone call. You cannot handle somebody else bringing some bad news to you. It's just something that you're just unable to handle stress. unable to deal with stress effectively. Anxiety and panic attacks come from that, where you're just totally overwhelmed and you're totally unable to function. You have anxiety and panic attacks. You desire to be alone. You isolate yourself. And of course, because if you're overstressed and you're overwhelmed and you're unable to deal with certain things, and you're just feeling so depleted and drained, and if you're not your best self, you're not at your functioning highest capacity, you're going to isolate yourself. You're going to want to isolate yourself. At least desire to isolate yourself and be alone, because you just can't handle it. You're overwhelmed and stressed and depleted, and you don't think you can handle one more thing. If one more thing happens to me, I swear, I'm done. It's over for me. That's the language of emotionally fatigued people, is where they said, I just can't deal with it. I'm so tired. I'm just so tired. I'm so spent. I don't think I could do anything more. I don't think I could handle one more problem. I don't think I can handle one more person coming to me with some demands or expectations, and I don't think I can give it. And physically, I don't think I can handle it. Trust me, and I know, if I'm making these episodes, I'm not going to be speaking about anything I can't relate to. I relate to this 100%, because I've been emotionally fatigued so many times. I can recognize it right off the bat. I know what it feels like. I know when I'm going through it. I know when I'm spent and worn out. I know when I just feel like I can't tolerate anything. I know what it feels like. Emotional fatigue is not spoken about so much. I just don't hear people speaking about emotional fatigue. I hear them speaking about physical fatigue. I hear them talking about exhaustion physically after a workout, or being too tired because you don't get enough sleep, or I hear about mental illness, I hear about mental disorders, but I don't hear about emotional fatigue. People don't talk so much about the emotional part of us. The emotional part is just as important. It's just as important. We need it to be functioning at its highest capacity. So I know what this feels like. Trust me. I know what this feels like. Emotionally fatigued, just feeling like I just cannot handle dealing with any more stress. I can't handle dealing with any more depression. I just can't handle exuding any more emotions. I feel like it's going to break me. I don't think I can take it. I don't think I have any more left. Yep. Totally get it. Totally understand. And so the next point is, and this is the last point, is paranoia. I don't know why I'm struggling with that word. I know that word. Paranoia. When you feel paranoid, emotional fatigue, exhausted emotions can cause you to feel paranoid. Why is that? Because, how do I explain it? It's just because you're overwhelmed and you're spent. And when you're overwhelmed and spent and you do not have the resources, or you don't have the wherewithal to deal with the demands that's placed upon you emotionally, it's going to make you paranoid, and it's going to make you fearful. And because you've gone through so much, and you've dealt with so much, and you've had so much expectations and so much demands and so much that you had to extend outwardly, and you had so much yet you had to give, you had so much that you had to do, and you've cried a lot, and you've been angry a lot, and there was always something, one thing after the other, one thing after the other. It puts you into this pattern of like, oh my God, when is the next time I'm going to have to extend this energy? When is the next time I'm going to have to deal with more depression? When is the next time I'm going to have to be frustrated? When is the next time someone's going to ask me for this, and so wants me to do this, and I have to do this at work, and they're expecting me to do this over here, and I'm so tired, I'm exhausted. It's going to make you paranoid, because you're expecting something else to happen for you to deal with. And it's a crappy feeling, because it's like when you're devoid, when you're deficient of something, and you feel like there's going to be another demand that's going to be placed on top of you who's already weary and exhausted, and you feel like you can't take anymore, it's going to make you paranoid. It's going to make you fearful. Your mind has set a pattern. Emotionally, you're spent. Mentally, you're overwhelmed. And you feel like, okay, well, something else is going to happen. And you know what? You can be in a state where literally nothing is going wrong. Things are pretty calm. Things are pretty relaxed. But because you're just in this state of emotional exhaustion, you just feel like any minute now something's going to happen. Any minute now something's going to go wrong. Any minute now somebody's going to come to me with their problems, or something's going to break, or something is going to, burst into chaos. Something's going to happen. And physically there is no reason for you to be paranoid. There's no reason for you to be fearful, but because you're so exhausted, it just makes you feel like you're so spent and you're so anxious and stressed. You're thinking that something else is going to happen. Something bad is going to happen. That's just what I found. To understand that, when you're exhausted and depleted, it does some weird things to your mind. I'm telling you, it really does some weird things to your mind when you're exhausted in this way. And now, so with that said, now we're going to go more specifically into another kind of fatigue. Well, actually, it's the same fatigue, but it's more specified to a specific way that we can become emotionally fatigued. Let's put it that way. So emotional exhaustion can go directly in hand with something called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue. Okay, so compassion fatigue. This is when you become emotionally and physically drained and depleted in the caring of others. Okay, so this is where it's specific now. You become drained and depleted in the caring for or in the midst of others who are in distress, traumatized. So whether they're, let's say, in an abusive situation, or they're terminally ill, or they're injured, okay, or something like that. They're in their own trauma. They're in their own distress. And you're witnessing this. Or you are around these people because you're caring for them on some level. You're caring for them emotionally or physically, or you're caring for them while they're in this state. This is probably the most ideal atmosphere, not ideal atmosphere, but this is the atmosphere in which many people become emotionally fatigued and or burnout, because they're around people who are experiencing trauma. Okay, so another term for compassion fatigue is secondary traumatization. So that means that you're experiencing this trauma from someone else. Someone else is dealing with it, someone else is going through it, and because you're in the midst of them or you're caring for them, the point is that you're around people who are suffering, and it causes a traumatization within yourself. And because naturally, humanistically, we're empathetic. Naturally, we are. By nature, we are. So if we see someone else is suffering, we suffer too. We feel what they're feeling. We put ourselves temporarily in their shoes, and we feel that pain. And I think it serves a really good function because it helps us to care for each other. It helps us to have compassion for each other so that we can help each other and serve each other and help each other become or put ourselves in a place where we're better able to flourish or be, right? So secondary traumatization is going to come from being around people where you're empathizing with and you're having compassion for, and it, because of what they're suffering, you somehow suffer because of what you're witnessing and what they're going through and what their problems and issues are, and it affects you. It affects you. It may not affect you right away, or you at least may not feel the effects of it. You may not know that you're being affected by it, but you are being affected by it. And the more you're you're around, and the more you are around those people, the more you're caring for those people, the more you're in that atmosphere of people suffering, the more it's going to affect you, and the more it's going to wear down on you. Okay, because it comes inside. You take on some level what they're going through. I just think that's a natural thing. Humanistically, that's a natural thing. It's a natural thing for us to feel empathy and compassion for other people. But what I'm saying is that can turn into a problem because we are becoming traumatized by other people's trauma. And what happens is, over time, with this compassion, if you are in a situation where you're in the midst of these people who are being traumatized or who have been traumatized, you experience burnout. Just like what I was saying about emotional fatigue and burnout, you experience burnout. So that means that your compassion lessens over time. Or you get to the point of complete indifference. And I believe that in the brain, this is what the brain does to protect itself from this extreme stress that you are undergoing as a result of seeing other people that are in distress. That's what the brain does to protect itself, I think, because it becomes too much sometimes. It becomes overwhelming. It becomes too much sometimes. So from the extreme stress, by association, you just, your brain just says, okay, well, I'm just going to turn this compassion off. Or let me just put it this way. Your emotional reserves are just depleted. You just can't deal with it anymore. You just can't deal with it anymore. This is what we call burnout. And compassion fatigue can happen professionally. This is what I've seen. This comes from personal relationships or just relationships professionally. So for example, if you're in a profession where you're taking care of people directly, you're directly caring for someone mentally or physically, okay, or emotionally. So whether you're a counselor or you're a nurse or you're a doctor or you're emergency medical staff or you're just in the midst of caring for someone and you're seeing someone suffer, you're someone who goes on a campaign to help women who have been in domestic abuse, or you're saving someone, or you have a center for someone to come in who have been abused or abused children or things like that. That is the biggest atmosphere for compassion fatigue, for sure. Because I'm pretty sure you're already an empathetic and compassionate individual, which is the reason why you're in that position, why you're in that profession in the first place. But after a while, it gets to be too much. Okay, and also it could be personally. It could be personally with just people in your family, people that you're around, and perhaps you're caring for someone who is physically sick, who's physically disabled, or someone who's suffering that you know of, someone who is your cousin who's in an abusive relationship, a physical abusive relationship, and you feel helpless to help them, and you can see that they're suffering and you don't know what to do about that. That is a perfect atmosphere for compassion for fatigue. Okay, but anyway, I'm still going to give you some signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. So the first point is indifference to others and their suffering. And this happens when you're in the burnout stage, okay? And this is before you've had compassion and understanding. You've always had compassion and understanding, but then you get to the point where you're starting to burn out and you're just not, you're becoming indifferent to other people and their suffering. That's more in the burnout stage, where you're really burnt out, yeah. And anger and resentment toward them. This is anger and resentment toward them. So possibly if you're in professional relationship with someone and you're just getting tired of them being in your care. You're getting tired of seeing them. You're tired of their issues and their problems. You feel resentment for their issues and their problems and their tears and their whatever. You get angry and resentful. You can feel angry and resentful toward you and your life and your life role and your life purpose and your life role in their life. Okay, how your role plays in their life. You can become angry and resentful because you're tired of the suffering, or you're tired of the pain, or you feel helpless to help them. You feel helpless, and that can turn into anger and resentment. Yep, that's absolutely what can happen. So the next point is anxiety, increased anxiety. And this is before burnout. I should have really said the first point last, because that can kind of make things sound a little bit confusing. So let's just say indifference is at the bottom. That's really when you're experiencing the real burnout. But anyway, anxiety, increased anxiety. Increased anxiety. So that means that you're anxious because of what that person needs and how they're suffering, and possibly, you're not doing enough and things are getting worse. You develop some more anxiety because of that. It causes excess anxiety to know that someone is suffering and you're possibly doing the best you can, or you're helpless to know that you can't do anything about it. Because it's not just about you, that person being in your care. You can just be in the midst of. You're in the midst of this. You're in the midst of this. You're in a situation where that's just what you're seeing. You're just seeing it, but you can't help, or you cannot alleviate that suffering. So that can cause anxiety. Anxiety you can feel in your life, just in your life towards situations of any kind. Just anxiety toward other people and their care. You feel anxiety to expectations, to their wants, to their needs. And I think I'm just basically describing someone who's in a professional situation, a situation where you're professionally taking care of someone in this way, or personally in someone in your family and you're caring for them, and you're becoming very anxious and very tired of the expectations, the wants, and the needs. And you may even start to avoid and be more avoidant of these things because you're getting burnt out. Perhaps you don't want to answer phone calls, or be available to them or anyone else. So this goes right back into emotional fatigue. This is emotional fatigue. It's just specified to a particular circumstance or situation. Or that's where it can derive from, is from other people. And that's how we become emotionally fatigued. But yeah. So you may start to avoid things. Avoid people. Avoid answering phone calls. You don't want to be available to anyone else because they're just wanting. And they're suffering, and their suffering is stressing you out. And the stress comes from the trauma that you're experiencing because of their trauma, and you're helpless to really change it, and you're getting angry and frustrated and resentful, and then you're becoming anxious because you're angry, resentful, and frustrated. You know what I'm saying? Like, it all goes into one big circle. You might get anxiety and panic attacks if it gets that far. Yeah, for sure. It's the same thing. It's really the same thing. Irritable, miserable, pessimistic about life, about yourself, about the world, about your career. If that's where it's coming from, if that's really, the point of where all of this is coming from, you may get pessimistic about your career. But irritable, miserable, and pessimistic, you're just not in a good mood because all you're dealing with is suffering. And you're becoming emotionally burnt out. And sometimes you even may feel guilt. And this is another point that I didn't put in. But you might feel guilt because you're feeling this way. You're feeling guilty because you don't want to help. or you're feeling guilty because you're feeling burnt out. You're feeling guilty because you're in a better position to help them, but you are doing the best you can, and still it's not alleviating their suffering. So you can feel guilt, or you can feel guilt that you're angry with them and resentful because you're just tired. You know what I'm saying? It all goes into one thing. But yes, and if this goes on long enough, this can lead to depression. Of course it can lead into depression. Of course it can lead into depression and hopelessness and despair, which is depression. And then a whole lot of other stuff comes with that. But yes, depression is definitely something I'm going to be speaking about very, very soon. In a few episodes or so, I'm going to be speaking about depression. So yeah, depression, it can definitely lead to depression if it's not reversed and you don't find ways to manage or cope, especially if it's a professional situation. Something that you have somewhat of a control over. No, you have control over it. You have control. So it can lead to depression. And then that obviously can lead to neglect of yourself, neglect of everything else within your life. Sleeplessness. That's a big one too. If you have a compassion fatigue, you most likely are going to have sleeplessness and sleep disturbances because of these issues of anxiety and anger and resentment, and also because of specifically dealing with that person and that person's issues and the things that they're suffering. You might not be able to turn your brain off. You might not be able to turn your brain off. Excuse me, my tongue is really tied today. You might not be able to turn your brain off. So you're experiencing memories and flashes of events of, their words, their suffering is stuck in your head. Whatever it is. There's like so many scenarios, so it's like I can't really come up with that. I cannot come up with that. Maybe you've seen someone get into an accident. Maybe you've seen someone be abused. Maybe you're watching them, they're in a situation where they're literally dying, they're literally dying, or they're terminally ill. So it's that type of thing, and it causes sleeplessness. It causes sleeplessness and disturbances. And of course, your physical body is attached to your mental and emotional states, so you can experience health issues. If it's gone long enough, and it just depends on everybody. It depends on yourself specifically, because everyone's different. But yes, health issues. Because the stress erodes your brain, the stress erodes your body over time. So your immune system may not be as efficient. You might have heart palpitations, an upset stomach and nausea, headaches, body tension. All of that can come from stress and anxiety, panic attacks, dread, It can come from a form of PTSD. PTSD of witnessing someone else go through that type of thing, perhaps. Or just from the stress, the expectations, the anxiety. Just dealing with trauma secondarily. It affects your body too, you know what I mean? So yes, you may go through something within your own self and you experience trauma, but then someone else may go through some trauma too, but it affects you directly. It affects your health directly too, if you're around it often. And you have loss of focus and concentration and fogginess. So yes, it's very, very close. Very, very close. In fact, it is. It's the same thing, but like I said, it's a little bit more specific than emotional fatigue. Emotional fatigue is more broad in terms of that can come from your own specific trauma and your own specific issues and problems and the things you've had to deal with. But compassion fatigue, you can experience emotional fatigue because of someone else's trauma and someone else's pain and sorrow and issues. But it all causes the same problem. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. So I just wanted to take my time to truly discuss this topic of emotional slumps, fatigue, and exhaustion, and hopefully it provided some insight or a different perspective into maybe what you're experiencing. You know, you could be experiencing something and you're wondering, why am I so tired? Or why do I feel so numb? Why do I feel so this? And why do I feel so that? So maybe it can provide a different perspective, or it can probably answer some questions as to what it is you've been experiencing. So I hope that helps. And, you know, also to put a name to, most likely if it is what you're experiencing, it helps to put a name to what it is that you might be going through. And then you can take that step with this knowledge to healing and reversing it. So part two, I'm gonna give some tips and some different ways that I've used to help myself with these problems, which is emotional fatigue, emotional exhaustion, emotional slumps. Okay? So that's all I have for you for today. And thank you for listening to A Woman's Guide in Reclaiming Wholeness After Sexual Abuse. If you enjoyed this, you can subscribe to this podcast to hear more episodes. So next week, we will explore part 2 of this episode, like I just said. So be sure to tune in. And until next time, take care.